You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. The Trump administration is attempting to revamp homelessness policy in the United States. Late last week, the president signed an executive order that, among other things, ends federal support for policies that employ the housing first model. It also calls for an increase in involuntary commitments for people with mental health conditions or substance use disorders. The order aims to drastically change how cities and states respond to the homelessness crisis. Will James is the host of Lost Patients, an award-winning podcast about homelessness and mental illness in Seattle, and he's here with more context on this story. Will, thank you very much for being in studio today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Libby.
So the president is trying to overhaul homelessness response in the country, and he's using a familiar tool, the federal grants and funding processes, to kind of leverage local governments. At least that's how I read the order. Mm-hmm. What were your initial thoughts after seeing this EO?
My initial thoughts were like, this was expected. This was a long time in the works. This is the project of roughly a decade of work by conservative activists, conservative influencers to sort of impose a more assertive or more punitive approach on cities and counties dealing with homelessness and mental illness. You got to understand, like, for at least a decade now, the sort of visible homelessness in cities, the sight of people in mental health crisis out on the streets, people using drugs in public, this has been a really powerful force in conservative politics. You know, Trump ran on this in 2016. He ran on it in 2020 and 2024. Conservatives all around the country and here in Washington State run on this idea that liberal cities, progressive-led cities, are chaotic and dangerous and breaking down. And there have been activists like Christopher Rufo here in Seattle who have been building up this intellectual framework of, like, what is the conservative approach to this? And the answer is often, you know, a sort of backlash to harm reduction policies, to policies that give a lot of freedom of choice to the people who are dealing with these situations like homelessness, and kind of wanting to, you know, take them off the streets, sort of assertively, you know, remove them and put them in other settings.
Yeah, the argument that there has been like this overly permissive framework in liberal cities, and that's the source of the problem. And so if you just reverse that, then homelessness could be solved. I want to get to the parts of this executive order. So there's two main things that we're going to address today. The first is about involuntary commitments. And we'll talk about what the order calls for specifically in just a moment. But first, just quickly remind people, how does involuntary commitment work? What is it?
Sure. If you are really, really ill with a serious mental illness, if you are so ill that you are in danger of hurting yourself, hurting someone else, destroying your home, if you can't feed or take care of yourself, the government is allowed to step in and involuntarily hospitalize you, basically detain you through a civil process, even if you are not accused of a crime. And this is a really, really thorny area of law and policy and medicine. It is all of those things kind of mixed together where these decisions are made. But it is what allows authorities to pull you out of your home or off the streets if they consider you so ill that you are in danger.
There is a hearing process, as you mentioned.
Right.
The executive order that the Trump administration released last week, it really encourages the expansion of that process and involuntary commitments by state and local governments. What does that tell you about the president's philosophy when it comes to addressing homelessness?
Yeah, it meshes with this overarching philosophy that the problem with American cities right now is that we are not assertive enough with the people who are suffering from these problems. We are not, we are too permissive. We are too forgiving. And
rather than it being a lack of services,
right.
The housing crisis, all these other compounding factors, it's about liberal policies basically failing.
Right. And this says that, you know, Trump and his administration have really bought into that view. It's not a surprise. It really started taking shape during his first term. So it seems like this has, sort of blossomed and come to fruition in his second term.
So holding somebody against their will, as you mentioned, it's very ethically complicated. There is a great exploration of this and the process in Washington State in Lost Patients. If people want to check that out, it's available from KUOW and the Seattle Times podcasts. Also in this executive order, this is the involuntary commitments issue is next to policies like Housing First, which the Trump administration is targeting now. All of this seems like it has become a priority of the right. Has it always been a partisan issue? Does it surprise you that it seems like this is now a more partisan issue?
Yeah, I mean, this has not always been a partisan issue. I mean, involuntary commitment is very, very partisan kind of within the mental health world. So you have families and some providers of mental health care who really advocate more assertive treatment, expanding the situations where they're allowed to involuntarily commit people. And you have patients and patient advocates, arguing for years that these laws are coercive, they are dangerous, they are an infringement on civil liberties. And so those sides within the mental health world are very, very polarized. But politically, less so. Democrats and Republicans have both argued in favor of expanding involuntary commitment over the years. So that's a little blurrier when we try to impose that on our partisan political landscape. Housing First, which you just mentioned, has been pretty bipartisan for years. And so that is a little surprising that has become such a Republican-Democrat issue.
You mentioned that some Democrats have argued for expanding involuntary commitments. We've seen states like California, New York, and Oregon recently move in various ways to do that. Mm-hmm. These are Democrat-led states, obviously. In Oregon, at least, a lot of that push, as you mentioned, came from family members whose loved ones have severe mental illness or drug addiction. Is Washington looking at doing anything like that? Have there been conversations like that in our state?
It has happened over the years, yeah. For instance, the definition of the situations in which you're allowed to involuntarily commit someone have kind of expanded over the years in Washington State. So laws have passed that have allowed kind of family members and people close to a person to question a decision if a person is not considered sick enough to involuntarily commit. A family member can sort of appeal that or question that decision. We've expanded it so that people who are disabled by drug use can now be involuntarily committed in certain situations. And, even this current city council has considered expanding this. So, Washington is definitely part of that conversation at the local level.
So we talked a little bit about Housing First. The president has in his order sort of an implicit threat to withhold HHS and Housing and Urban Development grant money from programs that use that model. So we should probably just kind of set the table here. What exactly is Housing First? Yeah,
Housing First is the decades-old idea that the best way to deal with homelessness, especially people who are chronically homeless and very ill on the streets for years, is to put them in a stable home permanently first, and then address issues like mental health and drug use and trauma and physical health issues that they're dealing with on the street. That these problems are better dealt with when someone has their own apartment rather than trying to treat them out, in alleyways and shelters.
So you don't have to be sober. You don't have to be in rehab necessarily. It's about getting stable first.
Right. You get a home first, regardless of what else is going on with you, and then deal with the other stuff later.
And is it fair to say that that is the dominant strategy in King County, for example?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this has this philosophy, Housing First, Seattle was an early adopter of it back in the 90s. We have permanent supportive housing is kind of the main way that Housing First manifests here. It's like permanent apartment buildings where people get mental health care and drug treatment. And we have more of it in King County or in Seattle than we have shelters or transitional housing combined. So we are pretty heavily invested in Housing First here.
So the president makes it clear that he thinks that this policy has failed, that, housing first has been detrimental to getting more people off the streets. It's now again become kind of a Democrat coded thing, Democrat city coded. How did housing first, do you think, become a target, and why do critics dislike it?
Yeah, I mean, first off, they point to the fact that we've invested. Housing first is very, very expensive. You could argue, and there is evidence that it's more expensive to let people kind of decline on the streets and treat them in emergency rooms. But, putting that aside, it is expensive to run lots of permanent supportive housing. And yet homelessness has persisted and gotten worse in cities like Seattle all over the country. So this has, generated a lot of doubt and skepticism. Also, it is, again, in this landscape where permissive or forgiving or kind of welcoming aspects of homelessness or approaches to homelessness are considered like liberal, housing first has definitely been lumped in with that. It is, I think, offensive philosophically to a lot of conservatives that people are being given homes without being required to do drug treatment or without being required to take medication for their schizophrenia.
It's the personal responsibility philosophy.
Yeah. It's the idea that, well, maybe people would do better if they were held to account in some way. The thing is, we did try that for many, many decades before Housing First came about, and there were real problems with the personal responsibility approach as well.
And I can't emphasize enough from my reporting when I used to report on homelessness, how difficult it is for somebody to be in treatment when they are on the street. I mean, it's just really inconsistent. You lose medications, you don't show up for appointments, things like that. So there is definitely a huge downside as well of trying to require that of people before they have housing. What about the plausibility of all of this, Will? I mean, a lot of decisions about harm reduction or housing first approaches are made by individual organizations. They're policies set at the county level or the city level. Can the federal government actually compel this in a city like Seattle, for example?
Well, you're right. Yeah, like a lot of these policies are made at the state and local level, like our involuntary commitment laws. Those are state laws. But the federal government has a really, really powerful weapon here, and it is the billions of dollars in federal funding that institutions count on and local governments count on for mental health care and homelessness. So the reason that Housing First and permanent supportive housing proliferated across the country is because under the Obama administration, they really incentivized it by giving federal funds out to organizations that were prioritizing housing first. And so the Trump administration can do the same thing in reverse by channeling funds to certain organizations and certain local governments that are doing certain things. They can really create incentives for these policies to change.
Yeah, withholding something here, prioritizing it somewhere else. We have about 90 seconds left, Will. I know that this is a big question, but your podcast, Lost Patients, looked at deinstitutionalization in the mental health and addiction sphere in this country and the history of it, from JFK on. And it seems like President Trump is trying to turn back the clock, trying to change things and go back to the days of institutionalization for people who are struggling. Is that possible? Is it desirable? What do you think?
He is. He's talked about bringing back the big state psychiatric hospitals that we largely shut down during deinstitutionalization. Is it possible? The infrastructure is largely gone. And is there an appetite for it? Those hospitals were incredibly expensive to run. And that's why a lot of Republicans who now want to bring back institutionalization were against it back in the 70s. They wanted to shut down these hospitals because they were so expensive.
The idea was to create community care, though, which didn't really materialize.
Right. Yeah. Is it desirable? I think what most policymakers would say is that we should fulfill the promise of what deinstitutionalization was meant to do back in the 60s and 70s, which was create a widespread system of community care outside of the big psychiatric hospitals. So by tightening these laws or by creating more involuntary commitment and less housing first, we're not doing that. And that is a real potential hurdle of these policies that the Trump administration is rolling out.
Will James is the host of KUOW's Lost Patients. Thank you, Will.
Thanks so much, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.